Happening right now, you are looking at a live feed from Washington, D.C., where they are preparing to celebrate the Martin Luther King Jr. 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. MLK delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech right here 60 years ago. Thousands converged on the nation's capital over the weekend for the momentous occasion. And the leader of Omaha's NAACP says Dr. Martin Luther King would be disappointed to see how slow progress towards equality and unity in this country has come in 60 years. Around 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial when King made his speech, looking for racial and social equity, jobs, and a way out of poverty. Many thought the nation had turned the corner when we elected an African-American president, but the president of Omaha's NAACP believes having a person of color in the White House fanned the flames of racism in the country.
On one sense, we could say it's shocking, but you know, as a clergyman, as a pastor, I think we should expect that, because we should expect the opposition. We should expect that there are people who just think differently. And I think it's very interesting that the election of President Obama really exacerbated some of those people's thinking.
Pastor Williams says civic and church groups here in Omaha are working to fight poverty in Omaha's minority communities and continue to get more people registered to vote.